Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today for this session on decolonizing peace-building practice. We still have a number of our colleagues who are still joining us, so we're going to give it just another minute or two before we get started. But thank you all so much for joining. I ask that while you're joining, could you please mute yourself and make sure that your name is as you would like to be referred to, and include your pronouns if you would like to do so as well. All right. Welcome again, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining. So, welcome to a conversation on decolonizing peacebuilding practice. I think many of you have been a part of previous conversations on decolonizing the sector, and so we're here to expand a little bit on that and really dig into some of the specific ways that the peacebuilding sector still has a lot of work to do when it comes to decolonizing its own approaches and recognizing the power imbalances within its approaches. And so before we get started, I invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. While I introduce myself here, my name is Shannon Page. I'm a policy associate at Peace Direct. And I also want to extend my apologies because Dylan Matthews, our CEO, is no longer able to join us today. And so you have me today, and we'll have a bit more time for conversation as a consequence. But thank you all so much for joining. And in the chat, if you could just include your names, where you currently are, and what brings you here today. What are you hoping to leave this session with? Hi, Samira, welcome. All right, everyone, I won't force you to introduce yourselves, but it is nice when we have a sense of who's in the room. So, especially with conversations like this, so people really feel more comfortable sharing some of their thoughts, some of their learnings, so on. So please don't hesitate to continue to introduce yourselves while I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And so, as I mentioned, this is a follow-up conversation on our previous report, Time to Decolonize Aid. And it is helpful just to get a sense of who in the room is familiar with that previous report. And so, Aisha, if you could, I'd like to share a poll with you, just to get a sense of people's familiarity with this topic and specifically with our report. Beautiful. So just to take a minute, I see that a number of people have not read our first report, Time to Decolonize Aid, and also that we do have some people who are unfamiliar with the term decolonizing aid in general. So I just want to take a few minutes to really clarify so that I can make sure that we're all having the same conversation before we get into our presentation, get into some of the very preliminary findings from our consultation on decolonizing peacebuilding practice, which only took place last week. So you're really getting the very early findings and some of the earliest recommendations. And then I'm going to transition us into some breakout rooms so we can reflect a little bit on what we mean and what the peace building sector itself needs to contend with, and then bring us back for a broader discussion on how to move forward with some of the findings that we have and some of the realizations that we now have. So to start with, when we talk about decolonizing aid, and here we're using aid as a bit of a catch-all word for the wider peacebuilding sector, we are really referring to addressing and dismantling the matrices of power, so these overlapping ways that different power dynamics function, and how these power dynamics that we understand as emerging from the colonial period. So they initiated in the colonial period and have since changed and mutated and look quite different, but some of the underlying beliefs are rooted in structural racism and rooted in other forms of very specific exclusionary discrimination. And so it is a complex term that is one that really arose out of a lot of academic thought. And I know it's quite controversial, so I do welcome a bit of a discussion around that later on if and when people feel called to, but just to make sure that we're all having the same conversation, I wanted to start with that. Now, in May of this year, Peace Direct published a report with ADESO, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, and the Alliance for Peacebuilding on Time to Decolonize Aid, on decolonizing the sector. And so we really were examining the ways that these power dynamics and the ways that structural racism manifested in the sector. And so I really do encourage you all to take a look at the report. It is an incredible piece of work. I'm really proud of it. We have quotes from people, from almost 160 participants from all across the world, everybody from activists to practitioners to, academics and policymakers, who are really reflecting on how do these power dynamics and global inequalities manifest. And so with that understanding, I'm going to then transition to our presentation. Thank you. So, next slide, please. So just a little about Peace Direct for those who may not have encountered us before. We were founded in 2002, and our primary focus is to support and amplify the voices of local peace builders to the international community. And so really our core reason for existing is because we believe that people who are living close to conflict have solutions. And we believe that they have been doing work to address conflict and try and build more sustainable, more peaceful communities. And so it's our role to help them receive the funds and the support that they need to be able to continue to do their efforts. And so we really, it's also helpful, I think, to define peace building, especially when we're talking about decolonizing peace building here today. And so when we define peace building as an array of processes, approaches, and stages needed to transform conflict toward more sustainable, peaceful relationships. So this is quite a broad, expansive term, and that's because we have partners who do everything from, rehabilitating former child soldiers to addressing sanitation issues in their community to prevent conflict. So it can cover an array of
Shannon, we cannot hear you anymore. Shannon, I see you now. Could you?
I am back, yes. I'm so sorry. I seem to have been kicked out of Zoom.
No
Can everyone
problem.
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you, and apologies, everyone. So as I was saying, this is an expansive term, and we deliberately leave it as an expansive term to allow peace builders to self-identify and really to encompass every method of conflict prevention that sometimes we can't even imagine. And so it's intentionally broad and I think does cover.
Shannon, we can not hear you again. Could you please check your microphone if it's on the right setting?
Apologies, it seems my internet is unstable and I don't know how to manage that. Potentially, if I keep getting kicked off, Ravel, could you potentially step in for me because it keeps kicking me off, and I deeply apologize, everybody. I think we're going to move to the next slide, and I do want to try and get us to the substantive part of this presentation. So, as I mentioned, we published Time to Decolonize Aid, and we've been sharing the report's findings all across the sector. And we've really had the opportunity to learn from a variety of stakeholders. And over the course of these conversations, we have found that many across the sector are deeply committed to acknowledging structural racism. Similarly, many organizations have created continuous opportunities for discussions on structural racism, power, and equity and inequity in their own organizations, but also in their partnerships. And yet, despite these promising starts, we've also found that many are unsure about how to operationalize the recommendations. And so many are also in this process of conflating DEI efforts with the wider decolonizing movement. And so really, in the past year, since the murder of George Floyd, which, was a spark for us to really start to publicly discuss some of the things that we had been internally discussing, as well as, since the publication of the report, the conversation has progressed to a point that I don't know that I could have imagined, and I'm feeling incredibly heartened by. And yet, there remains a widespread sense of uncertainty as to what is to come next. So this most recent, report the report that's published, we produced it because we were really realizing that, yes, the system needs radical change, and there are certain things that we kept hearing again and again about how, local actors can't be trusted, that they lack capacity, that civil society doesn't exist in this region. We've also heard that, there's a risk of fraud and mismanagement of funds that is simply too great, that these local groups cannot meet our compliance requirements, and so we simply can't partner with them. And we've also heard that these groups potentially simply don't exist in some of the regions that we are working with, or that they aren't effective. And so all of these things are untrue, and also we were unsure and couldn't figure out why we kept finding the same excuses and same challenges again and again. And we realized that much of this resistance is rooted in overt and structural racism, which is barely acknowledged by those in the sector. So that prompted us to produce Time to Decolonize Aid. But, the production of this report wasn't easy. We received a lot of internal resistance and external resistance, and since the publication, a lot of resistance as well. And yet, even then, we've also realized that we need to go deeper. And so then we decided to do a little bit more research. So this was on the first consultation, but then, so just some information on the first consultation. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Sorry, this is the right slide, I guess.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. A bit of a delay. The slide after this. And can I please ask that everybody mute themselves just so that we can all really hear? Thank you. So really, yeah, so these are some of the key findings from our first report about, the fact that decolonization was a useful term, though participants were in disagreement as to whether or not it was the most relevant term to continue to use, but for now it is the one that they thought was useful to frame this conversation, that the sector does have its roots in colonialism, and that even though we often like to consider ourselves, those of us in the global north, as apolitical or neutral, participants really vehemently rejected that notion and argued that, in fact, we were more rooted politically and historically than we were comfortable acknowledging. Similarly, participants were clear that structural racism was so deeply embedded in the everyday culture of the sector that it affected even how local INGOs understood their own communities. And so, we heard stories about the current system and structure rewarding local organizations who knew how to quote unquote play the system by feeding into these assumptions. Can I have 1 second? Common terms and perceptions that reinforced neocolonial perceptions were, again, such as lacking capacity, such as aid in general, were really rejected by participants. Great. So also we found that program and research design was really rooted in Western values and knowledge systems, and that local knowledge was often devalued and not recognized. And so really often we saw participants sharing stories about not being viewed as experts despite their lived experiences and arguing, well, maybe I don't have a degree from, insert Western institution, but why is my lived experience not deemed valuable when it comes to leading any sort of programmatic or research design? So throughout the consultation, we found that practitioners were described as feeling lesser than their white colleagues, and especially in countries that were engaging with INGOs, especially when engaging with INGOs or donors outside of their country, they found themselves often having to play catch up in situations and not being invited into certain spaces. Now, this was especially true for practitioners who held multiple marginalized identities. So if they were a young person, or if they also, were a woman or had a disability or had multiple overlapping identities. And so they shared that they experienced this dismissal more frequently and more intensely than some of their other colleagues. And so during the consultation, the initial consultation on decolonizing the sector, we heard that COVID-19 could present a unique opportunity because while we all know that it exacerbated inequalities, everybody from the global north went back home by and large. And so that created an opportunity for those in the global south to demonstrate their ability to lead programs, to lead research, and to lead this conversation. Now, in our most recent consultation last week, already participants are sharing that despite this opportunity, the sector has simply continued to revert back to the status quo as we have shifted into a new era of the pandemic. And there has been little meaningful change in terms of compliance requirements or any other form of easing that might allow people from the global south to just more meaningfully engage with the sector. Great. So the main recommendations that we wanted to go through, again, I encourage you to read the report because I'll spend not so much time on them here today because I do want us to transition to our conversation. Was this acknowledgement that structural racism exists and to encourage conversations with partners, grantees, communities about power and how we wield it, those of us in the global north, as well as how it is wielded both internally and then with our partners. Similarly, we really encourage everybody to create spaces for local groups to strategize together and share experiences without feeling like they're observed. And this
I think Shannon has some difficulties with her Wi-Fi, maybe. Rafael, could you confirm? Would you like to take over, Rafael? You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
No worries.
I think Shannon's just come back right now, so I'll let her carry on.
Yeah, so again, apologies for my unstable Wi-Fi. I wish I could do something to change that, but unfortunately, I simply can't. Yeah, so create spaces for local participants to strategize together without feeling observed. They invited us to reassess the language that we use and to retire language that diminishes the agency of local people. And really to, for example, capacity building. We've heard so many times that capacity building simply does not resonate for participants. And so how could we find new language? So one thing that came out of the consultation was the notion of capacity bridging. And so that was something that we really thought was quite an interesting way to make that shift. Encourage an internal culture of openness to critique in order to challenge racist and discriminatory practices. That was also something that we really found was essential, because if as an organization you haven't addressed things internally, it's then incredibly difficult to address those when you're having relationships with partners. And so any biases or racist practices that are present internally are then going to be reflected in ongoing partnerships. We encourage everybody to fund local groups more courageously and remove the onerous due diligence and compliance processes, and to recruit differently. Really consider who's in the room, and not only who's in the room, but who has decision-making power, who gets to decide what the focus of the program is going to be, who gets to decide what the focus of the research is going to be. All of these are forms of power that I think we have naturalized to such a degree that we don't recognize it as significant. And so what would recruitment potentially look like if we recruited differently? What would it look like if we didn't value or didn't only value higher education, and instead we turned to people with lived experience and also viewed that as a form of expertise that was necessary for our organizations to thrive? Also investing in indigenous knowledge creation. So as mentioned earlier in the presentation, just so often these forms of knowledge are rooted in Western ideology, and those who have their lived experiences and who may understand the context more closely are not really brought in meaningful ways. So how can we make those necessary changes? Next slide, please. Great. So thank you so much. And so now, perfect. We are going to transition into a conversation with just between you. And so we're going to divide you into small breakout rooms. But before we do that, I did want to allow for 5 minutes of Q&A on this before we then transitioned into a breakout room discussion, just so that we can keep the So for the conversation, I invite you to raise your hands, and we're just going to take a few minutes to discuss if you have any questions, and then we'll transition into small breakout room discussions where we'll have an opportunity for you to reflect a little bit deeper on how this relates to peace building specifically, and then we'll bring it back and share in the plenary once more. Amy?
Good morning. Thank you so much, Shannon. This is kind of a quick or smaller question. I appreciated many things you said, but in particular, what really struck me is this point around the language. I know that that's something we struggle with, and we welcome recommendations. We welcome suggestions about how to say things differently. Is that something that Peace Direct, are you compiling, I don't know, a dictionary, but a list or something of vocabulary that you would recommend for the donor community? And that's a little bit smaller on the scale of these larger issues, but just wondering if that's something you guys are working on. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. So in fact, we have an internal document that we are in the, my colleague Ravel and I have been working on and expanding on. And yet I don't know that we've discussed sharing that more publicly, but perhaps we should, especially as this consultation that we just had last week, especially as we have time to synthesize some of those findings, and then moving on to subsequent consultations that we have planned on the topics of intersectionality and also on the topics of partnerships and equitable partnerships. So that is a very interesting idea that we, I think, should investigate. Samira?
I just had one question that we actually are talking about decolonizing peace building. My actually question is that how the result areas, the four result areas, the security, rule of law, peace processes, and social and economic reconstruction are actually contributing into these processes. And moreover, we usually talk about the three areas, but for the result 4, social and economic reconstruction, we somehow miss that out. So I just needed some clarification on this, and also your idea on what all the result areas are actually contributing towards decolonizing the peace building processes. That's it.
Thank you so much, Samira. Your question is a difficult one. I will be frank. I think many elements of the sector do, in fact, perpetuate these dynamics. And you mentioned social and economic reconstruction. You know, in the most recent consultation, we found that it wasn't so that participants felt where that was, you know, causing the perpetuation of these unequal global dynamics. Instead, rather, it was the way that these efforts were undertaken, where it was led by the global north, and there was only tokenistic involvement of those who were most proximate to conflict and had that lived experience. And so that was where the frustration, to my understanding, and again, we are in the very preliminary stages of addressing those findings, but to my understanding, like that was the primary thing that was discussed. And so, you know, I think then we could get into a broader conversation as to the role of the wider global system, where there are certain norms and economic systems that privilege certain regions over others, and that in that way reinforce dynamics of need and some might even say dependency, depending on where you are in the world. But I think that is a broader conversation, a longer conversation, and one that would, in all likelihood, require us to really bring in the economists, as well as the peace builders, as well as the humanitarians, as well as just everybody who's present here today on this call. So I'm not disagreeing, but I also think it is an incredibly complex intersection of global power dynamics, that peace building is simply one iteration of a wider context. Would you like to expand on your question?
Sorry. I hope I did not cut anyone.
No, it's okay.
Okay. What I wanted to say is that we are also working in the conflict affected zones, where getting employed or actually starting their own businesses have really contributed towards this for the peace building, has really contributed towards it.
Yeah.
And people are economically being satisfied with what they are earning, because initially they could not do anything because of the Talibanization. So actually this was my point, that they have come a long way to actually have peace in their homes, in their hometowns, in their own district, in their own area. So this is what I wanted to actually say. That's it.
Thank you. I don't think I have anything that would meaningfully add to that, but thank you so much, Samira, for your intervention. And that does, I think, raise an interesting and complex element to this. All right, so if we could transition to the small groups. Aisha, I don't know if you've had a chance to make those. Great. And I will, in the chat, just share some of the questions. And so we're going to have 10 minutes to discuss before we all come back together. And so, yes, I will share the questions with you once you are in your group shortly.
Hi, Shannon. Did you have a question or any questions for us? We're in a breakout group and we did not receive anything.
Okay. Okay, I'm sharing them in the chat once again.
Shannon, you should share them via the broadcast message to all. That's how they will see it. Or you can join the meetings, but I think that's a bit too much. So if you could send it in the broadcast message in the breakout rooms tab.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. I'll go back to my room.
Thank you.
Is there a way for us to go back to our rooms? We left because we hadn't received any message or any questions.
Yes.
Also, I was in room 6, but there was nobody there, so I left as well. Is there a way I can join another group?
Yeah, we can do that.
Yes, we can do that. Yeah. I will do that.
Aisha? Ravel, is Aisha gone? You're muted.
She's not on the screen at the moment, so my guess is that she has for the time being.
Okay. That's okay. I'm going to extend the time for the Zoom rooms.
Okay, Shannon, I just got into a meeting, but they cannot see the questions because it just pops up and then it just disappears. So what you have to do is to put it in the normal chat, and then
Okay, I'm going to send it to you because
yeah,
because I don't know what's happening, so I think I'm just going to send it to you. I think people are starting to trickle back. Fantastic. Okay, well, let's give it a few minutes as people finish up their conversations. We didn't want to just poll everybody. That's always a little bit aggressive. So let's let everybody finish their conversations. But in the meantime, and then we'll go into a bit of a share back. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience as we've navigated some tech challenges today. I know that's never pleasant when you're in a session, and I just really appreciate all of your patience. Okay, we're gonna give it about, I think, a few more seconds. Almost everybody is back, but not everybody is. All right, well, thank you. So I know that you shared in the Jamboards, and so I'm going to ask that you just give us a little bit of insight into some of what was shared in your groups, and then I think it would be great for us to have an opportunity to reflect together on some of what was discussed. And so please feel free to yeah, Giacomo, we're just trying to stay within the time. I know it's always difficult, and especially because we got the questions to you a little bit late, but that's what this part of the conversation is. Hopefully we can continue this conversation here a little bit as well. So just in response to the first question, I think that's a really difficult one, and I would welcome people to share how has structural racism manifested in your own efforts. I think that this is one that causes a lot of us to become a little bit defensive, since this is work that we do as we, are trying to help others and so on. But I really welcome responses or just, insights into some of the conversations that you had.
Shannon, we didn't, I was just sharing my experience of being in South Sudan for trying to help work with people on reviving their peace agreement. And the basis of all the conflicts in South Sudan is interethnic, with very, very difficult politicians who siphon off all the resources. So basically, we were talking a little bit about that. And I'll just stop. Maybe other people can continue.
Please all feel free to jump in. This part is supposed to be a bit more of a conversation, so don't hesitate. All right, well, transitioning to our second question, how can peacebuilding contend with the concept of neutrality, and can anyone be neutral? I think this is something that is really relevant when we're talking about conflict resolution, mediation, peacebuilding. Very, very often, we have this idea that having an external actor, a foreign actor to the context is better because it can act as because they can act as a neutral figure. But how does that then play out when, in fact, as we've seen, our participants and those in the Global South don't feel that anyone is truthfully neutral? And so how do we contend with that? And is there something other than neutrality that we should be looking to as we try and figure out who's the best person to serve in those roles?
If I may jump in. So yeah, I definitely think it's an extremely interesting question. And I personally believe that the whole idea of neutrality doesn't exist. When we exchange with someone, we are also, the person is having a perception of us, and we're having a perception of the other person in every relationship. And I personally work on EU-Africa relationship. And of course, in that context, we have also preconceived notion. So the communities have notions of us, preconceived notion, and we also have them. And I think as the international community, we go into this type of work thinking sometimes that we are neutral. But I think the work we have to do is a work on ourselves first and try to think, how can we also think of us as a non-neutral body, because we are not. And in that, maybe building a more trustful relationship and maybe also a more sustainable relationship.
I'm so grateful, Kausar, and please feel free to correct my pronunciation, that you brought up this notion of trust. I think that's so essential in these relationships, and especially when dealing with issues of conflict and peace. And it isn't something that we think about often with regards to us. I think often we talk about trust within the conflict affected community and within different parties and how they feel about one another, but how they feel about us is something that I think we still need to really grapple with, I think, a little bit more. So I'm really glad that you brought that into this space. Please, Lena. Lena, potentially? I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Please correct me.
Thank you for bringing the notion of neutrality. Yes, please. No, it's okay. The notion of neutrality in conflict transformation is a bit tricky. What we need to accept is when we get into peace building, we go sometimes with prejudice, and we study about the other person, and we already get, prejudiced in a way we are going to approach. The only thing we can talk about now in terms of conflict sensitive, gain the trust, and then also to support in that act of mediating, reconciling, and then transforming conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to raise what Camille shared in the chat, which is that they discussed two issues: how the whole development sector is based on the underlying principle that capitalism is the best model, and how research quality is very based on the Western concept of what good research is. And so I'd like to actually bring that into the space. We have coming to the end of our time, and I want to give us appropriate time to really close out. But I think that notion of capitalism is one that I'm seeing increasingly in these conversations as to what is it that what are our own motivations and guiding principles that we may not even recognize are informing how we are relating to communities and advising communities and working with communities. And so capitalism is definitely a framework that is coming up again and again. And I'd be curious to see if that's something that you are all also finding in your own work, that critiquing and even just reflecting on capitalism and its role on your efforts is something that is happening. Perhaps not. I know that's a bit of a sensitive topic to raise in a public space. I do want to spend some time on the third question, which is how can the peacebuilding sector, and with everybody here and their personal backgrounds and professional backgrounds, we can expand that, I think, to the wider aid sector. But how can the peacebuilding sector begin to create new approaches to partnerships without defaulting to the same elites or in-country office approaches that we've used in the past? So I know that this is a very difficult question. I know that potentially a number of your organizations use in-country offices or have existing relationships with certain locals, so I'd welcome it. And I see, Joan, that you have your hand raised. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Yeah, I don't know if this is what I'm gonna say or what I'm going to share is answering any of the, or, maybe it's like a whole holistic kind of, I guess, answer to the questions that you posted here. But yeah, I think that in terms of, I mean, look at who's in this room. We are the ones that have access to the internet, have access to connection, and already we are already, not including communities or members of community that don't have access to this conversation, to this space. So that alone, this act alone already is like, excluding others already. So I think we just have to be mindful that it's not, that there are things that happen that we might not always think about that's actually excluding, or it's a part of capitalism. Like we always think that there's one way for economic justice, but actually there's other ways. There are other ways of livelihoods and alternatives to livelihoods, and therefore aid is not the only thing that can solve, or foreign aid is not the only thing that can solve solutions. And also aid only brings people that are always on the table anyway. Like we bring the same people to the table. The country representatives or the program managers or whoever. And then I guess it kind of goes back to like the way that we hire. For example, we're always looking for people with degrees or whatever, and not everybody had access to education in the first place, especially girls, like they didn't have access to education. So when it comes time to look for a job already, like, again, they're being marginalized all over again because of the system that we are working in. Whatever this system is, whether that's, that's within structural racism or systemic racism or whatever it is that we need to really, those are the systems that we need to break down. And I think it starts with like organizations or like leaders in organizations to just, to be more bold in the way that we do little things like hiring, things like that. And the way that we think about aid, and also the way that when we do monitoring and evaluation, for example, evaluation, like where does the learning go? It doesn't always go back to the communities. The priority is like, oh, the donor should know this, or like the organization or our partners. We don't prioritize communities when it comes to learning. What are we finding actually in the communities that we work in? We're not sharing that back. It's not systematic that we share that back, and we need to really change the way that we do that. So again, like we need to really break down the little things that we do right now. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Joan, for that intervention. It was incredibly challenging and incredibly insightful. Kausar, I see you also have your hand raised, please.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I just wanted to come back also on the point of capitalism and maybe expand it on a political level. And I think we can also reflect on how democracy is also seen often as the model, the good model that we should actually implement. I hope you hear me well, not with too much interference. But yeah, I think also political structures, we have to think of that because in my work, when we look at African societies, a lot of them are not organized in the same way that European societies are organized. And in that way, often we try also to impose a certain organization of society, a certain economic model that is deemed to be the best one, being it capitalism or democracy. And then we see that it doesn't work because the societies do not function that way. So I think we also have to go to the communities and ask them what works for them and go from here and not try to do the reverse position.
And I think that was something that really came up time and again in our consultation last week on peacebuilding specifically, which is that, the aim of peacebuilding, the society that so often, organizations based in the global north are trying to create, those are societies that then mirror those organizations in the global north. And so we go and we try and resolve conflict, but to us, what looks like sustainable peace is something that looks like our own societies. And so that is really, I think, a real challenge that was raised in our consultation that we are trying to figure out how to contextualize within the existing literature about peacebuilding and the existing critiques of peacebuilding. I want to raise some of the amazing comments that are happening in the chat. So again, we have Camille who's sharing that one challenge to developing an approach that is not engaging institutionalized elites is due diligence processes required by donors and strategic partners. We often have this challenge when we want to diversify partnerships to less established out of capital city or youth or other unregistered organizations. I know this is something that Peace Direct's own partners, we partner with a number of network organizations or youth-led organizations, and they do share that it is incredibly difficult to be viewed as legitimate actors for peace because of their identities and because of who's leading their efforts. And so that, I think, the due diligence processes required by donors is just another limitation, another limiting framework that is incredibly difficult to navigate. And I would welcome any reflections on that if that's something that anybody is working through, because I know that a number of organizations and foundations are reflecting on how they can alleviate some of the compliance processes, the due diligence processes, and make them more accessible to non-elites. And then below we have another comment from AK saying that neutrality should also entail the allowance of failures, which in turn can lead to meaningful insights on various approaches which were missed during the conceptualization of projects and programs. And this, I think, is really key. The notion of failure and the willingness to have it is not something that we have really seen a lot of in the sector, and peacebuilding specifically, because failure of peacebuilding efforts means more conflict. For us, it can feel, and it often is, a life or death situation, and so there is a lot more pressure. But in terms of funding approaches, in terms of programs, failure is inevitable. And so how can we really shift some of our thinking to not perceive failure as something that is inherent or is an increased likelihood when partnering with local communities, to something that is an inevitable side effect or aspect of engaging in these efforts and funding more generally. So I do want to open the space to people to reflect a little bit more before we transition to some of the more recent findings from our most recent consultation. Okay, I did just want to leave that space open for a minute. And so, as I mentioned, this consultation took place last week. And so these are very, very preliminary findings. But I do think they're important to share with you all. And so I'm going to just share some of them here with you today. And so one thing that we found was that conflict analysis frameworks are, by and large, established through the white gaze and are largely ethnocentric. And so they fail to acknowledge local realities that are based on theory rather than experience. And so we had participants who were sharing stories of frameworks being implemented in their context and struggling to recognize the relevancy of those frameworks, because those were incredibly theoretical and were largely removed from the understandings that they had. Similarly, we found a number of participants were sharing that these frameworks were rooted in this notion that, there's certain ways or certain people, we have assumptions as to who are the key actors to bring into negotiation spaces, mediation spaces, and participants shared how so often those key actors don't include women, don't include youth, don't include people who maybe have less economic purchasing power. So already there, as we're building peace, we're building a peace that is largely serving certain communities over others and privileging certain communities over others, which was one, I think, preliminary finding that I found very, very confronting. Another preliminary finding that I really wanted to raise in this space that we haven't had a chance to discuss yet today was just how much of these international interventions are dictated by geopolitics. And so we did touch on this a little bit with capitalism, and Professor, I think you began to really bring that into this space, but a lot of participants really did feel as though the motivations of the international community as to who and what to be involved in was motivated by the self-interest of different countries and donors. And so that was something that was raised that we found participants were in a lot of agreement about. And really, there seemed to be a lot of skepticism as to who should be present in those spaces. And the final thing that I wanted to raise that we didn't come to naturally was that, as we've discussed, these funding dynamics are reinforcing colonial dynamics, but once again, with conflict, they are privileging certain elites over smaller, non-elite actors in conflict-affected situations, and therefore inadvertently reinforcing the capacity of those who might use their power against others, rather than leveling the playing field. So these were some of the things that were raised. I know that we are coming to the end of our time, as it has just been an incredible opportunity to speak with you all today, to review our first consultation, our first report, and talk a little bit about structural racism, and then transitioning into thinking specifically about peace building and how peace building itself is also inadvertently propping up and upholding these inequities and these dynamics. And so as we close the space, I want to leave you with some reflections, and I hope that you carry these with you. And so firstly, I'd like to invite you to really reflect on what are the motivations for engaging in peace building in a particular context. It's not always going to be clear, and it's not always going to be a singular motivation, but I think there is something to be said for the number of participants who felt that we held ulterior motives or self-serving motives that were more important than the actual peace in the area that we were working in. So definitely something that I think warrants a bit more reflection on our part. In a similar vein, I think we should really call into question, what do we understand by peace, and how that may differ from how other communities understand peace. A number of participants were sharing that their definition of peace likely looks different, as does their definition of conflict. And so without a shared understanding of those key terms and those key goals, very quickly any sort of framework and program is not the needs and desires of participants. And then the final reflection that I invite you all to take with you is that of your own role and responsibility and your own neutrality or lack thereof. I think we had a really interesting conversation today, and really, I think even within the space, we're agreeing that the notion of neutrality and us as neutral actors is largely a fallacy. And so how can we really begin to reflect and internalize that we aren't neutral, and how then to use that awareness as we move into spaces, especially spaces that are foreign to our own. And so again, thank you all so much for joining here today. I know that we've had some tech challenges, and again, I thank you for your patience and just your understanding, and I hope you have an amazing rest of the conference. Thank you, everyone.